This video tutorial is compatible with Photoshop CC and Photoshop CS6. In this project we're going to create a tilt shift effect using the new blur gallery. Okay, I've got a snapshot of the after effect here, so I'll just click on that so you can see we've got this delicious blur moving off into the background and also the foreground here, giving this image a nice sort of toy town effect, miniaturizing the whole of Manhattan here. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can achieve that. I'll just click on the original snapshot there, and we'll move over to the layers panel. Okay, if you do want to do this reasonably non-destructively, you may want to duplicate the background layer. I'll just right click on there and click on duplicate layer. Okay, now we've got a background copy. I'm going to apply the new filter to this layer. So we'll come up to the filter menu and choose blur and come over to tilt shift. Okay, and this opens up the new blur gallery here, and we have options of field blur, iris blur, and also the tilt shift that we've got going here. Okay, now the first thing we've got to do is move this pin to the area where we want our sharpest focus. So I'm just going to click and drag this down to this pedestrian crossing here in the lower portion of the image, and then let go. Okay, and the next thing we'll do is we'll raise the blur slider so we can defocus the areas in the foreground and also the background. I'll choose a blur of around about 35 pixels here, and just raise that a little bit more. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the depth of field. So we're just going to drag that a little bit closer to this guy crossing the pedestrian crossing, and this one a little bit closer as well. We've also got this fading to maximum blur here, so we can reduce that as well to decrease the depth of field even further, both in the background and the foreground there. We could zoom in to take a closer look at the effects of the blur, and that'll take a few seconds to render that blur there, and that's creating a nice effect. If we want it any shallower, just again keep modifying the feather of the blur until we get the right effect that we're looking for. Okay, now we also have the options of adding bokeh to this image, and we can do that just by clicking on the light bokeh slider and then dragging that up. Now what this will do is it will blow the highlights of this image, but also create some interesting bokeh effects in some of the brighter areas. Let's see if we can invoke some here. I'll also add some bokeh color. We can see the bokeh appearing up here in the image. Okay, and I'm just going to drag that bokeh color, which will increase the saturation of these colors here, and that's taking a few seconds to update because we're in zoomed in view, and we could just increase that a little bit further to get some nice saturation going on in that bokeh. If some of the highlights are blowing out prematurely, then just decrease the range of the highlights that are actually blowing out there. So I'll probably raise this to around about 240 or so. Okay, so we're getting some interesting effects now without blowing out too much of the highlight information. Only the brightest highlights are now blowing out. If I just hold down the space bar and drag to some of those blown highlights in the background in the Times Square there, you'll see that those are being blown out, emulating the sort of effect we might achieve in the lens. Okay, and I'll just fit on screen, Command 0 or Control 0 to fit on screen. Now before we apply OK, I'm just going to click on the Save Masks to Channel, and this will allow me to pick up this as a selection later on, so we can modify with adjustment layers the outer focus areas independently of the areas that we've decided to leave in focus here. And I'll just select OK. And again, that will take a few seconds to apply because we are applying quite a sophisticated blur to these outer focus areas. Okay, and as it applies, we're going to move over to the Channels panel and pick up this mask that is being saved there. Okay, over to the Channels panel. Here is our blur mask, which controls the outer focus areas, and we're just going to hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC and click on this blur mask to load it as a selection. And now we're going to return to the Layers panel. Okay, let's bring up the adjustments I'm going to just choose a very simple brightness contrast adjustment for this exercise, and what we're going to do is we're just going to modify the color and tonality and contrast of these out of focus areas, maybe just making it a little bit brighter, and also raising the contrast, okay, of those out of focus areas. Now this is working independently of the areas which are left in focus, because if we return to the layers panel, you can see that brightness contrast is being masked over these areas, and so we can see just the out of focus areas are being modified. We could add additional adjustment layers using this mask to modify those out of focus areas.